Welcome to the Moonlit Archive. Tonight's entry, the coin that burned into stone. There is a green stain on the floor of the Basilica Aemilia in Rome. You can see it if you know where to look, a faint circle of copper green, roughly the size of a child's palm, burned into white marble. It is a coin, or rather, it was a coin. 1,500 years ago, when the Visigoths sacked Rome in the summer of 410 AD, the fires they set were hot enough to melt bronze currency into the stone floor of this ancient building. The coin fused with the marble. It became part of the architecture, and it is still there. Think about that for a moment. A coin that someone dropped or clutched or flung aside in terror on the night Rome fell is still embedded in the floor where it landed. 16 centuries of rain and dust and foot traffic, and the stain remains. You can walk up to it. You can touch the spot. The marble is smooth, but the green is unmistakable. And that is not even the most disturbing thing frozen into these stones. A few hundred meters away, there is a platform, a speaker's podium, where a man's severed head was once displayed as a public warning. His hands were nailed up beside it. The head belonged to the greatest orator Rome ever produced, a man who had once saved the Republic with nothing but his voice. We will come back to that. And there is a road, a ramp, really, climbing the Capitoline Hill, where a slave once stood behind a victorious general in a golden chariot and whispered into his ear the most unsettling sentence in the history of power. We will come back to that too. But first, the place itself, because the Roman Forum is not what most people think it is. It is not a building. It is not a temple, not a monument, not a ruin in the usual sense. It is a space, an open-air rectangle, roughly 600 feet long and 200 feet wide, pressed into the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills. For 1,000 years, from the Age of Kings through the Republic, through the Civil Wars, through the rise and fall of the emperors, this was the center of Western civilization. Every major decision that shaped the Roman world was announced here. Trials were held here. Funerals were held here. Triumphs were celebrated, and conspiracies were hatched, and a dictator's body was burned on a pyre while the crowd wept and rioted in the firelight. 600 feet long. Think of 2 football fields laid end to end. That is all. The space that governed an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, from the Rhine to the Sahara, was smaller than a modern shopping mall. And yet, if you could stand in this space on any given afternoon in, say, the year 50 BC, if you could somehow be transported back, you would find yourself in the noisiest, most chaotic, most politically charged piece of real estate on earth. Senators in white togas arguing on the steps of temples. Lawyers pleading cases in the great basilicas. Money changers shouting rates from their stalls near the Tabernae Novae. A funeral procession pushing through the crowd, mourners wailing, while somewhere a herald reads out the latest military dispatches from Gaul. Children darting between the columns. Slaves carrying amphorae of wine. A priest slaughtering a bull on the steps of the Temple of Saturn, the blood running into a bronze catch basin while the flies gathered in the midday heat. The smell, and this is something the history books rarely mention, would have been extraordinary. Incense from the temples, thick and sweet. Roasting meat from the sacrificial altars, because the Romans did not waste good beef. The gods received the smoke, and the priests ate the flesh. Sweat, perfume, leather. The sharp tang of urine from the fullers' shops nearby, where workers used human urine to process wool. The faint sewer stink of the Cloaca Maxima running beneath your feet, carrying the runoff of a city of 1 million people toward the Tiber. Bodies pressed together in the summer heat, because this was a Mediterranean city without air conditioning, without deodorant, without any of the chemical barriers we place between ourselves and the reality of our own bodies. The Forum was not a museum. It was alive in the way a marketplace is alive, a courthouse, a cathedral, and a political rally all compressed into the same space at the same time. It was loud. It was crowded. It was magnificent, and it was squalid. It was the best and worst of what human beings could build when they decided to govern themselves. That is what we are exploring tonight. Not the ruins, the life. Not the stones, the people who walked on them. 12 chapters, each one anchored to a specific person and a specific moment, stretching across 1,000 years of history. We begin in the swamp, because before the Forum was the center of civilization, it was a graveyard. Before it was a graveyard, it was a marsh. And the story of how a stinking valley between two hills became the most important piece of ground in the Western world. That story starts with engineering, with mud and ambition, and the stubborn conviction that you can make the earth obey you if you are clever enough. It starts with a drain. If you are settling in for the night, this is a good time to let the day go. There is nothing here that requires your attention in any urgent way. No notes to take. No test in the morning. The Forum has been waiting 25 centuries to tell its story. It can wait a little longer for you to get comfortable. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. Let the blanket settle around you. Let whatever happened today, the noise of it, the tension of it, the accumulation of small urgencies that make up a modern life, let all of that begin to loosen and fall away. You have nowhere to be, nothing to fix, nothing to plan. The story will be here whether you stay awake for all of it or drift off somewhere in the middle. It has survived the fall of Rome, 1,000 years of burial, and the slow, patient work of excavation. It is not going anywhere tonight. Long before there were senators and emperors, long before there were temples or triumphal arches, there was a valley. A low, marshy depression between two hills, prone to flooding, thick with reeds and home to the dead. The earliest Romans, if we can even call them that, these small communities of shepherds and farmers living in thatched huts on the Palatine Hill around the 8th century BC, used this valley as a burial ground. They dug graves into the soft, wet earth and laid their dead to rest in simple pits. Some were buried with modest offerings, a clay pot, a bronze fibula, a handful of grain. Some were cremated, their ashes placed in small hut-shaped urns that mimic the thatched dwellings of the living. Archaeologists found these graves in the early 20th century, deep beneath the pavement of the later Forum. The excavations were painstaking. Layer after layer of fill had to be removed, each one corresponding to a different century of Roman history, before the excavators reached the original valley floor and the burials that lay beneath it. The skeletons were small, shorter than modern Romans by several inches. Their teeth showed the wear of a grain-heavy diet, emmer wheat and barley, ground on stone querns that left tiny mineral fragments in the flour, which slowly ground down tooth enamel over a lifetime. Their bones showed the stress of physical labor begun in childhood, thickened muscle attachments, stress fractures healed and refractured, the deep marks of a life spent carrying, lifting, digging. These were not the marble-draped patricians of legend. These were subsistence farmers. Their world extended 5 miles in any direction at most. They knew the Tiber because it flooded their valley. They knew the hills because the hills kept them safe from the flood and from enemies. And they knew this low ground between the Palatine and the Capitoline as a place that belonged to the dead, a liminal space. Not quite the world of the living, not quite the world below. Damp, quiet, thick with mosquitoes in summer and knee-deep in water in winter. The valley flooded regularly. The Tiber, swollen by winter rains in the Apennine Mountains 60 miles upstream, would back up into the low ground and turn the burial area into a shallow lake. You can still see the evidence of these floods in the archaeological record, layers of river silt deposited between the grave cuts, gray-brown alluvial clay that smells, even now, faintly of the river. In summer the valley drained mostly, leaving behind standing water, clouds of mosquitoes, and the particular smell of river mud baking in the Italian sun. A smell that would have been familiar to anyone who lived near the Tiber. Mineral, organic, faintly sweet, underlaid with the sulphurous tang of decomposing vegetation. Not an auspicious beginning for the capital of the world. Would you have looked at this swamp and seen a future? Would anyone? transformation started, according to Roman tradition, with a king. Not Romulus, the legendary founder, but a later king named Tarquinius Priscus, the fifth king of Rome, who ruled in the late 7th century BC. Tarquinius was Etruscan by origin, and the Etruscans were engineers. They built roads through hills and tunnels through mountains. They understood drainage. They understood the relationship between water management and civilization, that you cannot build a city without first controlling the water. They had been doing it for centuries in the cities of Etruria, carving channels through volcanic tufa, lining them with stone, moving water where they wanted it, and away from where they did not. What Tarquinius built, or more accurately, what he ordered built, using the forced labor of Rome's common people, the plebeians who had no political voice and no choice in the matter, was the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. It was, at its core, a covered channel that collected the runoff from the surrounding hills and carried it down through the valley to the Tiber. But to call it a drain is like calling the Hoover Dam a wall. The Cloaca Maxima was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. Its main channel was lined with stone blocks fitted so precisely that many of them survive without mortar after 26 centuries. Portions of it were large enough for a man to walk through upright. The Roman writer Strabo describes boatloads of hay being floated through the sewer, which gives you a sense of the scale. The main outfall into the Tiber was an arched opening 11 feet in diameter. You can still see it today. A dark semicircle in the embankment wall near the Pont Palatino, still flowing, still draining the ground after 26 centuries of continuous operation. 26 centuries. That is not a typo. The Cloaca Maxima is still functioning. Rainwater still flows through channels first cut into the earth when Homer's poems were new, when the Greeks were still colonizing Sicily, when Babylon was the largest city in the world. The engineers of King Tarquinius built something that would outlast their language, their religion, their entire civilization. It may be the oldest continuously operating piece of public infrastructure on Earth. What else from our century will still be working 26 centuries from now. And it changed everything. Once the valley was drained, it could be paved. Once it was paved, it could be used. The dead were moved to cemeteries outside the settlement, a profound shift because it meant the living were claiming space from the dead, asserting that this ground belonged to the future rather than the past. The reeds were cut. The ground was leveled and covered in packed earth, later in gravel, later still in stone, and people began to gather. The earliest form was nothing grand. A cleared space with a few market stalls, a wooden platform where disputes could be settled, a well for drawing water. A fig tree, the Ficus ruminalis, said to be descended from the tree under which the she-wolf nursed Romulus and Remus. The tree was sacred, tended and replaced when it died, a living link to the founding myth. Sacred ground, but simple. You would not have looked at it and thought here the center of the world. A man named Ancus Marcius, the fourth king of Rome, is credited with building the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, a wooden bridge constructed entirely without metal fasteners, held together by wooden pegs and joints, deliberately designed so it could be disassembled quickly in an emergency. The priests who maintained this bridge were considered so sacred that they took their name from the word for bridge itself, pontifex, bridge builder. The title eventually migrated to the head of Roman religion, the Pontifex Maximus, and from there to the Pope of the Catholic Church. Every time you hear the word pontiff, you are hearing an echo of a wooden bridge thrown across a muddy river in the 7th century BC. A word that has traveled 26 centuries without losing its shape. The form grew the way cities grow, organically, messily, one building at a time. A temple to Saturn went up on the western end, at the base of the Capitoline Hill. It was one of the oldest temples in Rome, and it served a double purpose that tells you everything about Roman priorities. It was both a house of worship and the state treasury. The aerarium. The Romans kept their money in a temple. They saw no contradiction in this. The gods protected the state, and the state's gold protected the gods' temple. It was circular, self-reinforcing, practical. Very Roman. 8 40-foot columns of gray granite survive from a later rebuilding. They are among the most photographed columns in the world, though most tourists do not know they are looking at a bank as much as a church. A temple to Castor and Pollux, the divine twins, the Dioscuri, who according to legend appeared at the Battle of Lake Regillus around 496 BC, fighting on horseback for Rome against the Latin League, rose near the southeastern corner. The Romans believed the twins had ridden from the battlefield to the Forum on the same day, watering their horses at the spring of Juturna, and brought news of the victory before any human messenger could have arrived. Only 3 of their columns survive today, standing in a row like the bones of a hand, their Corinthian capitals still sharp enough to cast shadows in the late afternoon light. They are 50 feet tall. Each column is a single piece of marble, quarried, transported, carved, and erected without any machinery that we would recognize today. When you stand beside them, you can press your palm against the stone and feel the fluting, the shallow vertical grooves that run the length of the shaft. The stone is warm in summer, cool in winter. It has been standing there for 2,000 years, and it feels like it could stand for 2,000 more. The Comitian appeared at the northern end, an open-air assembly space where the citizens gathered to vote, to listen to speakers, to participate in the public life of the Republic. This was democracy of a kind, limited, stratified, tilted heavily toward the wealthy, excluding women, slaves, and non-citizens, but democracy nonetheless. Roman citizens stood in this space and cast their votes. They argued. They shouted. They threw things occasionally. Roman politics was a contact sport. Elections were accompanied by bribery, intimidation, occasional street violence, and a constant background hum of factional maneuvering that makes modern politics look sedate. And next to the Comitian, the rostra, the speaker's platform. The place where Rome's fate was argued aloud in public under the open sky. A raised stone platform decorated with the bronze rams of captured warships, where any Roman magistrate or candidate could address the assembled people, where laws were proposed, where wars were debated, where the most famous speeches in the Western world were delivered. We will spend an entire chapter there. It deserves one. But for now, just hold this image. A drained swamp becoming a marketplace becoming a civic center becoming the stage on which a republic was built. Layer by layer, stone by stone, from mud to marble. The valley that belonged to the dead becoming the valley where the living made their most important decisions. There is a woman we need to meet first. A girl, really, when her story began. She was 6 years old when they came for her. Can you imagine? She was taken from her father's house and given to the goddess. And the fire she was given to tend would burn without interruption for 1,000 years. Her name is lost. Most of their names are lost. But we know that she was between 6 and 10 years old when the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, selected her from among the daughters of the city's noble families. We know that she was required to be free of physical defect, with both parents living, born of a freeborn family, and that she could not have been previously consecrated to any other god. We know that once she was chosen, her father's legal authority over her, the Patria Potestas, which in Roman law gave a father absolute power over his children, including the power of life and death, was severed. Completely. Permanently. She passed from his household into the service of the goddess Vesta, and she would not leave that service for 30 years. She was a Vestal virgin. The Temple of Vesta stood at the eastern end of the Forum, a small circular building, unusual in Roman architecture, where temples were almost always rectangular, aligned on a north-south or east-west axis, designed to face the rising or setting sun. The Temple of Vesta faced no direction. It was round. Its shape was ancient, deliberately archaic, evoking the round thatched huts of early Rome, the kind of hut that would have contained a family hearth at its center. And at the center of this temple, in a space that no man except the Pontifex Maximus was permitted to enter, a fire burned. Not a decorative fire, not a symbolic fire, the actual fire of the Roman state. The hearth of the city itself, housed in a temple because the city had outgrown any single house. The Vestals' only duty, their sacred, consuming, non-negotiable duty, was to keep that fire burning. If the fire went out, Rome was in danger. Not figuratively, literally in the Roman understanding. The Senate would convene an emergency session. Sacrifices would be ordered. The Vestal responsible would be stripped of her white robes and beaten in the dark, because the punishment was considered too shameful to be witnessed by the Pontifex Maximus himself. This was not metaphor. This was not ritual theater. This was Roman state religion, which did not traffic in metaphor. The fire was Rome's connection to the gods. If it died, the connection was broken. Disaster would follow: plague, invasion, crop failure, civil war. The logic was simple, unforgiving, and absolute. 6 Vestals served at any time. 6 women in white, their hair bound in the distinctive 6-braided style called the sine crines, a hairstyle so ancient that by the late Republic no one remembered its origin. Scholars believe it was the hairstyle worn by Roman brides on their wedding day, which would make the Vestals permanent brides, married not to men, but to the city itself, wed to Rome in a ceremony that lasted 30 years. They had extraordinary privileges. They were the only women in Rome permitted to own property in their own name, independent of any male guardian. They could make a will, something ordinary Roman women could not do. They could pardon a condemned prisoner simply by crossing his path on the way to execution. If a criminal's route to the executioner happened to intersect with a Vestal's path, the sentence was annulled. Their testimony in court was accepted without oath, a privilege shared by no other Roman citizen, male or female. They traveled in covered carriages through the streets of Rome, and anyone who failed to yield the right of way could be punished. At the great public games in the arena, they sat in reserved seats near the emperor. They were, in many respects, the most powerful women in the ancient world. And they paid for that power with their bodies. The vow of chastity was absolute, not temporary, absolute, for 30 years, from the age of 6 or 10 until the age of 36 or 40, A Vestal could not take a lover, could not marry, could not have children. She belonged to the city and to the goddess, and her body was not her own. A Vestal who broke this vow was not merely disgraced, she was sentenced to death. But because the shedding of a Vestal's blood was itself a religious pollution, because the very act of executing a sacred person would anger the gods whose favor Rome depended on, the method of execution was designed to avoid bloodshed. It was designed, in fact, to avoid the appearance of execution altogether. The condemned Vestal was dressed in funeral garments and carried on a funeral litter through the city, as though already dead. Mourners trailed behind, weeping, but their grief was constrained. The ancient sources note that the mourning was subdued, fearful, as though the city itself were ashamed. The procession wound through the streets to a place near the column gate called the Campus Celeratus, the Field of Wickedness. There in the earth, a small underground chamber had been prepared. It was furnished with a bed, a lamp with enough oil to burn for a few hours, and small quantities of bread, water, milk, and oil, just enough to sustain life briefly, so that the state could not be accused of directly killing a sacred person. A technicality, a legal fiction. The Romans were good at those. She was lowered into the chamber. The entrance was sealed with earth. The surface was leveled until no trace of the opening remained, and the city moved on. What does that tell you about a civilization that it could bury its holiest women alive and then simply carry on? Think about that. The most honored women in Rome, venerated as living embodiments of the state's sacred fire, could be buried alive if they took a lover. The power and the punishment were two sides of the same coin, both extreme, both absolute, both rooted in the Roman conviction that the state and the gods were bound together in a contract written in fire and flesh, and enforced with a cruelty that the Romans did not consider cruel. They considered it necessary. Over the 1,000-year history of the Vestal Order, ancient sources record about 10 Vestals who were condemned to this fate. 10 women, buried alive in the same field over the course of a millennium. Some were almost certainly innocent, political victims whose crimes conveniently served the interests of powerful men. When Rome suffered a military defeat, someone had to be blamed. The gods must be angry. If the gods were angry, someone must have polluted the sacred fire. The Vestals were the obvious suspects. Their purity was the city's insurance policy, and when the policy failed to pay out, they bore the consequences. In 114 BC, 3 Vestals were condemned in a single year: Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, following a series of military setbacks. The trial was ugly, politically motivated, driven by a populist tribune who used the case to embarrass the senatorial aristocracy. The evidence was thin. The verdict was preordained. 3 women went into the earth near the Colline Gate, and Rome felt better about itself. But there is one Vestal whose story survives as something other than tragedy. Her name was Tuccia, and she was accused of breaking her vow sometime in the 3rd century BC. The evidence against her was apparently strong enough for a formal trial before the College of Priests. She stood before the Pontifex Maximus and his colleagues, facing the underground chamber, facing the sealed earth, facing death. And she asked for a chance to prove her innocence. What happened next is recorded by multiple ancient authors, which suggests it was either true or so famous that no one dared omit it. Tuccia walked to the Tiber. The whole city must have watched a Vestal in her white robes walking through the streets toward the river, the crowd falling silent as she passed. She knelt at the riverbank. She dipped a sieve, a common kitchen sieve, a column open mesh, designed to let water pass through into the muddy water of the Tiber. And she carried it back to the forum full of water. Not a drop leaked through. The charges were dropped. I almost did not include this story. It reads like a fairy tale, a miracle narrative inserted into the historical record by later writers who wanted to make a theological point about divine justice protecting the innocent. But the more I looked into it, the more I found it everywhere in Valerius Maximus, in Pliny the Elder, in Dionysius of Halicarnassus, in Augustine's City of God. Roman authors treated it as historical fact. and more importantly, Roman artists depicted it for centuries. A painting of Tuccia and her sieve hung in the temple of Vesta itself. Coins were struck showing the scene. It became a symbol of innocence, of divine protection, of the power of faith. Whether it happened or not, the Romans believed it happened. And that belief tells you something important about how they understood the relationship between divine power and human innocence. The gods could suspend the laws of nature to protect the pure. A sieve could hold water if the woman holding it was truly chaste. The fire in the temple was not just fire. It was a bridge between the human world and the divine, tended by women whose purity was, literally, a matter of life and death. The last Vestals served in 394 AD, when the Emperor Theodosius closed the pagan temples and extinguished the sacred fire. By then, the fire had been burning, with only a handful of interruptions, for roughly 1,000 years. 1,000 years of women tending a flame through wars and plagues and political upheavals, through the transition from kingdom to republic to empire, through the reigns of good emperors and terrible ones. A chain of fire stretching from the age of Romulus to the age of Christianity, from the thatched huts on the Palatine to the marble palaces of the Caesars. When the flame went out for the last time, the women walked away from the circular temple and disappeared into history. We do not know their names. We do not know where they went. They had served Rome for 30 years each, and Rome no longer wanted their service. Their house, the Atrium Vesti, a large, luxurious residence on the southern side of the Forum with multiple stories, heated baths, and a courtyard garden, still stands in partial ruin. You can walk through the rooms where they slept and studied and argued and grew old. Statues of senior Vestals once lined the courtyard, carved in marble, their faces serene, their names and honors inscribed on the bases. Some of those bases still have names. Others have been chiseled clean, the names deliberately erased, the faces left intact, but the identities removed. We will encounter that kind of erasure again before the night is over. The Forum has a habit of it, preserving the body but destroying the name. The forum is quiet now. The fire pit in the Temple of Vesta is cold. The round walls are open to the sky, roofless, exposed to the rain. But the green stain of the melted coin, a few hundred meters away, reminds you that fire returned to this place one last time, uninvited, uncontrolled, and merciless. Let your breathing slow. Let the story settle around you like the warm Roman evening, when the light turns golden and the shadows lengthen across the pavement. There is a platform nearby, a stone stage decorated with the prows of captured warships, and the man who stood on it most famously was about to make the most dangerous speech of his career. The word rostra means beaks. Specifically, the bronze rams, the rostra, bolted to the prows of enemy warships and torn off as trophies after the Battle of Antium in 338 BC. The Romans had defeated the Volscian fleet, captured their ships, and ripped the bronze rams from the prows. These curved, pointed hunks of metal, each one weighing several hundred pounds, designed to punch through the hull of an enemy vessel, were carried back to Rome and bolted to the front of the speaker's platform in the forum. The name stuck. For the next 5 centuries, every speech delivered from this platform was delivered in front of the dismembered faces of enemy ships. It was a reminder, deliberate or not, impossible to ignore, that Roman power rested on military force, and that the words spoken from this stage carried the weight of that force behind them. When a senator proposed a war, he did so standing behind the beaks of ships captured in the last one. When a general requested a triumph, the trophies of past victories were literally at his back. The rostra stood at the western end of the forum, facing east, so that a speaker addressing the crowd would have the morning sun at his back and the full length of the forum stretching before him. On a busy day, the crowd might number in the thousands, citizens packed shoulder to shoulder in the open space, spilling onto the steps of the surrounding temples, leaning from the upper galleries of the basilicas, perched on the pedestals of statues, clinging to columns for a better view. There was no microphone, no amplification of any kind. A Roman orator had to project his voice across hundreds of feet of open air, competing with the ambient noise of a working city. The carters and the merchants and the sacrificial animals and the construction crews building yet another monument to yet another victory. This required training. Years of it. Voice exercises at dawn, breathing techniques learned from actors, rhetorical strategy studied from Greek masters. The Romans took public speaking as seriously as they took warfare, and for similar reasons. A well-delivered speech could start a war, prevent a war, pass a law, repeal a law, save a life, or end one. The voice was a weapon. The rostra was its range. The greatest speaker ever to stand on the rostra was Marcus Tullius Cicero. He was not born to power. His family was equestrian, wealthy enough, respectable enough, from the hill town of Arpinum about 60 miles southeast of Rome, but not from the ancient senatorial aristocracy that dominated Roman politics. He was, in the Senate's eyes, an outsider, a novus homo, a new man, the first in his family to reach the consulship. He had no military reputation, no inherited political alliances, no vast estates staffed by armies of loyal clients. He achieved the highest office in the Roman Republic entirely through his voice. And on the 5th of December in the year 63 BC, that voice was about to do something extraordinary. Rome was in crisis. A senator named Lucius Sergius Catiline had been plotting to overthrow the Republic. Catiline was a patrician, a former governor, a man of ancient family and violent temperament who had been passed over for the consulship and decided that if Rome would not give him power through the ballot box, he would take it by force. He had gathered an army of the disaffected, bankrupt aristocrats, drowning in debt, landless veterans abandoned after their military service, political outcasts with nothing left to lose, and planned a coordinated assault on the city. Fires would be set. Key officials would be assassinated. The conspirators would seize the government. Cicero, as consul, the highest elected official in Rome, had uncovered the plot through a network of informants, including a woman named Fulvia who was sleeping with one of the conspirators, and relaying everything he told her to the consul's office. And now Cicero stood on the rostra, or more precisely, in the temple of Jupiter Stator on the Palatine, where the Senate was meeting in emergency session to make his case. The speech is called the First Catilinarian Oration. It opens with a line that has been memorized by Latin students for 2,000 years. Quo usque tandem abuter, Catilina, patientia nostra? How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience? Cicero was not speaking to the crowd. He was speaking directly to Catiline, who was sitting in the Senate a few dozen feet away, surrounded by senators who had left empty seats on either side of him, a visible quarantine, a wall of absence. The other senators had literally moved their chairs away from the conspirator. Catiline sat alone in a void of his own making. You did nothing last night. You did nothing the night before. Where you were, who you summoned, what decision you reached, do you think any of us do not know? He was naming times and places, specific meetings, specific addresses. He was telling a conspirator to his face, in public, in front of the entire Roman Senate, that every move had been watched, every conversation overheard, every plan intercepted. What must it have been like to stand in that room? This took courage of a particular kind. Catiline was a violent man. He had been accused of murder, of corruption, of every vice the Roman imagination could supply. His followers were armed and desperate. Cicero had no army. He had no bodyguard beyond a few personal attendants and whatever informal protection the other senators could provide. He had his voice, his legal authority as consul, and his conviction that the Republic was worth saving through words rather than swords. The speech worked. Catiline fled Rome that night. The conspiracy was broken, or at least decapitated, its leaders arrested, and, after a brutal Senate debate, executed without trial in the underground prison called the Tullianum, just a few hundred feet from the rostra. Cicero was hailed as the father of his country, pater patriae, the savior of the Republic, the man whose voice had done what armies could not. And then the Republic devoured him. 17 years later, in December of 43 BC, Cicero was on the wrong side of history. He had opposed Mark Antony, Julius Caesar's political heir, in a series of brilliant, savage speeches called the Philippics, named after Demosthenes' orations against Philip of Macedon. 14 speeches, each one more devastating than the last. He had called Antony a tyrant, a drunkard, a disgrace to the name of Caesar. He had mocked Antony's oratory, his personal life, his military record. The speeches were masterpieces of invective, studied to this day in law schools and rhetoric programs. They were also death warrants. When Antony joined forces with Octavian and Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate, their first order of business was a proscription, a public list of enemies to be killed on sight, their property confiscated and divided among the triumvirs. Each man contributed names. Octavian supposedly resisted putting Cicero on the list. Cicero had supported him in the Senate, had called him a promising young man, but Antony was implacable. Cicero's name went on the list, near the top. He tried to run, indecisively, starting toward the coast, turning back, starting again, unable to decide whether to flee to Brutus in Macedonia or stay and face whatever was coming. He made it as far as his villa at Formiae, south of Rome, before the soldiers caught him. He was 63 years old. He was being carried in a litter. He was ill, exhausted, reduced from the vibrant orator who had shaken the Senate to a tired old man fleeing through the Italian countryside. According to the historian Plutarch, when the soldiers appeared, Cicero's slaves were ready to fight. But Cicero ordered them to set down the litter. He extended his neck from the curtain and looked at the centurion, a man named Hirnius, who Cicero had once defended in court, who owed his freedom to Cicero's advocacy, and said, "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly." The centurion cut off his head. Then, on Antony's specific orders, they cut off his hands. The head and hands were brought back to Rome. Antony's wife, Fulvia, a woman of fierce political intelligence and deep personal hatred for Cicero, who had insulted her in the Philippics, is said to have taken Cicero's head, placed it on her dining table, opened the dead mouth, and pulled out the tongue. Then she stabbed it with her hairpin, over and over. The tongue that had spoken against her husband, the tongue that had saved the Republic, the tongue that was, by universal agreement, the most gifted instrument of persuasion the Roman world had ever known. And then the head and hands were nailed to the rostra. The same platform where Cicero had denounced Catiline, the same bronze ship beaks, the same forum where thousands had cheered his name. His severed hands were pinned beside his severed head, above the crowd in the December cold, and left there for the city to see. The people of Rome walked past them on their way to the markets, the temples, the law courts. They looked up at the face of the man who had been pater patri, now a trophy, now a warning, now a lesson in the cost of speaking too freely. If you are still awake, I want you to hold this image, not for the horror of it, though the horror is real. Hold it for what it tells you about this place. The Forum was not just a stage for triumph. It was a stage for destruction. The same stones that heard Cicero's greatest speech witnessed his final humiliation. The same platform that amplified his living voice displayed his dead face. That is the kind of place this was. Every surface holds a double memory, creation and destruction, glory and blood, the voice that saved the Republic and the hands that wrote its epitaph, nailed to the same wall. What do you think? Was Cicero foolish to keep speaking when silence might have saved his life? Was the speech itself the point, regardless of what it cost? If you had been standing at the rostra that December morning, what would you have felt? The rostra still stands partially. A low stone platform at the western end of the forum, its surface pitted and worn. You can see the rectangular sockets where the ship beaks were mounted, now empty. You can stand approximately where Cicero stood. The morning sun still falls the same way, from the east, warming the ancient stone. The acoustics are still surprisingly good. Speak from the rostra in a normal voice, and someone standing 50 feet away can hear you clearly. but the voices are gone. The forum is quiet. The beaks have been removed, the metal long since melted down or stolen or corroded to nothing. Only the stone remains, pockmarked and patient, holding its double memory. There is another procession we need to witness, one that followed this same road, through this same space, up the hill behind the rostra. A procession not of shame, but of glory. The most spectacular public ceremony the Roman world ever invented. Imagine the sound first. Before you see anything, you hear it: drums, trumpets, the rhythmic stamp of soldiers' boots on stone, and above it all the roar of the crowd. Not applause, the Romans did not clap the way we do, but a full-throated roar, hundreds of thousands of voices raised together, a sound like the sea breaking on a cliff, a sound that shakes the air in your chest and vibrates in your teeth. A Roman triumph was the highest honor a military commander could receive. It was awarded by the Senate for a decisive victory over a foreign enemy, not a civil war, not a suppression of rebels, but a genuine conquest of a foreign nation. And it took the form of a procession through the streets of Rome, from the Campus Martius on the northern outskirts, through the city center, along the sacred way through the Forum, and up the Clivus Capitolinus to the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the summit of the Capitoline Hill. The triumphator, the victorious general, rode in a four-horse chariot called the Currus Triumphalis, his face painted red with vermilion in imitation of the ancient clay statues of Jupiter himself. He wore a toga picta, a purple toga embroidered with gold thread, so heavy that it required a slave to hold one end. In his right hand he held a laurel branch. In his left, an ivory scepter topped with an eagle, the bird of Jupiter. On his head, a laurel wreath. For this one day he was not a man. He was a god on earth, Jupiter incarnate, the embodiment of Roman power at its most absolute and its most dangerous. The procession entered the city through the Porta Triumphalis, a gate used for no other purpose, opened only for triumphs, kept sealed the rest of the year, and wound through the streets toward the Forum. In front of the chariot marched the spoils of war, wagons piled with gold and silver, captured weapons stacked like firewood, paintings of battles carried on wooden frames 20 feet high, scale models of besieged cities, exotic animals in cages. Pliny records that Pompey's triumph in 61 BC included a giraffe, the first one the Roman people had ever seen. Imagine a giraffe walking through the streets of Rome in a triumphal procession, towered over by tenement buildings, stared at by 1,000,000 people who had never seen anything like it. Behind the spoils came the prisoners, enemy kings and generals in chains, their armor stripped, their crowns removed, displayed for the crowd like living proof that Roman power had no limits. They walked their final walk through a city that was not theirs, toward a fate that was already decided. Most were executed after the procession, strangled in the Tullianum prison at the base of the Capitoline Hill, their deaths timed to coincide with the triumphator's sacrifice at the temple of Jupiter above. Behind the prisoners came the soldiers, thousands of them, marching in formation, wearing their decorations, carrying their standards. And they were singing. This was tradition. The soldiers sang bawdy, mocking songs about their commander during the triumph. Songs about his drinking, his womanizing, his baldness, his stinginess. Caesar's soldiers famously sang, "Romans, lock up your wives, the bald adulterer is coming home." This was permitted, expected, even required. It was a release valve for the tension of absolute power. A reminder built into the ceremony that the triumphator was still human, still subject to ridicule, still a soldier among soldiers despite the paint and the purple. And then the chariot itself, golden, massive, drawn by 4 white horses, rolling through the forum on the Via Sacra, the sacred way, the oldest road in Rome, its paving stones worn smooth by centuries of feet and wheels and hooves. The crowd screamed and threw flowers and wept. But here is the detail that has haunted historians for centuries. The detail that makes the triumph something more than a military parade. The detail that suggests the Romans understood something profound about the nature of power. Standing behind the triumphator in the chariot, holding a golden crown, the corona etrusca, above his painted head, was a slave. And that slave had one job, one sentence to repeat over and over into the general's ear, while the crowd roared and the trumpets blared and the world shook with adulation. Memento Mori. Remember you are mortal. Or in some versions, Rispus et post te, hominum te memento. Look behind you, remember that you are a man. A slave, the lowest person in Roman society, a piece of property, a thing with no legal rights, no name that history recorded whispering the most important truth in the world to the most powerful man alive. At the moment of his greatest glory, at the peak of human achievement, with a million voices screaming his name. A reminder that glory is temporary, that the paint will wash off, that the chariot will be stored in a warehouse, that the purple toga will be returned to the temple of Jupiter, that the god will become a man again, and the man will eventually die. Think about that. The Romans built this into the ceremony. They did not stumble upon humility, they engineered it. They understood something about the psychology of absolute power that most civilizations have learned the hard way, at terrible cost, that a man treated as a god may begin to believe he is one. And so they placed a corrective at the center of the spectacle. Not at the margins, not in a footnote, not in a private conversation after the parade. At the center, in the chariot, whispering in the ear that wore the crown. I have spent more time than I should admit trying to imagine what that felt like for both of them. The general, at the peak of human achievement, with a million voices screaming his name, hearing a slave's quiet voice cut through the thunder like a blade. Did he flinch? Did he smile? Did he nod in acknowledgment? Did he pretend not to hear? And the slave, invisible to everyone but the most important man in the world, saying a thing that no free Roman would dare say, over and over, a truth so dangerous that it could only be entrusted to someone with nothing left to lose. What was that like? What did they see in each other's eyes, the god and the property, standing together in a golden chariot, one wearing the crown and the other holding it? You do not know, we will never know, The ancient sources mention the slave but do not name him. He is a function, not a person, a mechanism of humility built into a machine of glory. But the Forum heard him. Hundreds of times over the centuries, this same ritual played out on these same stones. The chariot rolled. The slave whispered. And the general, for one brief moment, was reminded that all of this, the gold, the glory, the adoring crowd, the painted face of a god, was temporary. Mortal, subject to the same forces that would eventually crumble the marble and bury the Forum under 30 feet of earth. The Clivus Capitolinus, the ramp leading from the Forum up to the Capitoline Hill, still exists. It is paved in the original ancient stone, worn smooth by centuries of processions, polished by hooves and wheels and the sandaled feet of tens of thousands of soldiers. The triumphator's chariot would have climbed this ramp, the horses straining against the grade, the crowd pressing in from both sides, while at the summit the temple of Jupiter waited, its doors open, its gilded roof blazing in the afternoon sun, its altar prepared for the sacrifice that would conclude the ceremony. One specific triumph deserves our attention tonight, partly because it left a monument you can still see, and partly because what it celebrated would echo through history in ways no one standing in the Forum that day could have imagined. In the year 71 AD, the Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus celebrated a joint triumph for the conquest of Judea. The Jewish revolt had been one of the bloodiest wars in Roman history. 4 years of brutal fighting, city-by-city subjugation, mass crucifixions, and a siege of Jerusalem that lasted 5 months. The temple, the Second Temple, the center of Jewish religious life for over 500 years, one of the great architectural achievements of the ancient world, had been destroyed. Whether by order or by accident remains debated. According to the historian Josephus, who was present, over 1 million people died in the siege. The spoils carried through the Forum that day included sacred objects from the temple, the golden menorah, the 7-branched lampstand that had burned in the temple's inner sanctum, the table of showbread, on which 12 loaves were placed each week as an offering to God. The silver trumpets used to announce the holy days. These were not just gold and silver. They were not just valuable. They were the physical heart of a living religion, ripped from its sanctuary and paraded through a foreign city as war trophies, carried on the shoulders of Roman soldiers, while the crowd cheered and the captive Jewish leaders walked in chains behind them. The Arch of Titus, built after his death in 81 AD, stands at the eastern entrance to the Forum, where the Via Sacra begins its ascent from the Colosseum. It is still there. Walk through it if you are not among those who have traditionally refused to do so, and look up at the interior panels. On the south side, carved in marble relief, you can see the procession. Roman soldiers carrying the menorah on their shoulders, their faces turned toward the viewer, triumphant and young. The menorah is rendered in extraordinary detail, 7 branches, each one distinct, the base shaped like a hexagonal pedestal. This carving is our best record of what the temple menorah actually looked like. It was carved by Roman sculptors as a monument to Roman victory, and it has become one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding what was lost. For nearly 2,000 years, Jewish communities in Rome refused to walk beneath this arch. The memory was too fresh, the insult too deep, the loss too vast. The arch celebrated the destruction of the temple and the scattering of the Jewish people into a diaspora that would last 2 millennia. And then, in 1948, when the State of Israel was established, when the people who had been scattered returned, who had survived Rome and Babylon and the Inquisition and the Holocaust, the menorah from the Arch of Titus was chosen as the emblem of the new state. That specific image, carved by Roman sculptors as a trophy of victory, appropriated by the descendants of the defeated as a symbol of return. History does things like this. The Forum is full of such reversals, moments where meaning flips, where victory becomes irony, where a monument built to celebrate destruction becomes, across the long arc of time, a monument to survival. The Romans built the arch to say, "We won." 2,000 years later, it says something else entirely. The light is softening now. The story is settling into a slower pace, the way the Roman afternoon settles into evening, the shadows lengthening across the pavement, the heat beginning to break, the noise of the city subsiding as the working day winds down. Let your body settle with it. The great processions are over, the trumpets fading, the crowd dispersing, the torches guttering in their brackets. The Forum at dusk was a different place than the Forum at noon. Quieter, more reflective. The long shadows of the temples stretched across the pavement like dark fingers, and the last light caught the gilded rooftops and made them glow. A warm, amber light, the color of old gold, the color of late Roman afternoons. We are going inside now, into one of the great basilicas that line the Forum's edge. A trial is about to begin, and the young lawyer about to argue the case will, one day, have his head nailed to the rostra. But not yet, for now he is young, his voice is strong, and he is about to take on the most corrupt man in the Roman Empire. The word basilica in the Roman Forum did not mean a church. The word would not acquire that meaning for several centuries. In the Roman Republic, a basilica meant a covered hall, a long rectangular building with a high central nave, lower side aisles separated by columns, and a raised tribunal at one end where a magistrate could sit. The design was practical. It provided shelter from the rain and the sun, amplified the human voice, and could accommodate hundreds of spectators. The Christians would later adopt the architectural form for their churches, which is why churches are still sometimes called basilicas. But the original Roman basilica was a courthouse, a commercial exchange, and a meeting hall. It was where business was done, disputes were settled, and justice, such as it was administered. And on a hot day in 70 BC, in a basilica on the northern side of the Forum, a young prosecutor named Marcus Tullius Cicero, not yet the great statesman, not yet Pater Patri, not yet the man whose head would hang from the rostra, just an ambitious 36-year-old lawyer with a gift for language and a burning desire to make his name, was about to take on the most corrupt man in the Roman Empire. His opponent was Gaius Verres, the former governor of Sicily. Verres had spent 3 years in Sicily, from 73 to 71 BC, treating the province as his personal treasure chest. He had looted temples, stealing cult statues, sacred vessels, and votive offerings that had been accumulating for centuries. He had stolen private artwork from wealthy Sicilians, sometimes at dinner parties, simply pointing at a painting or a bronze and having his slaves remove it from the wall while the owner watched. He had extorted money from farmers and merchants, threatened their families, and condemned innocent men to death when they got in his way or when their property was convenient to seize. He had crucified a Roman citizen, a grotesque violation of Roman law, which exempted citizens from crucifixion under any circumstances. The list of his crimes was so long that the trial documents, when Cicero later published them, filled 7 volumes. The varying orations. They survive in full. You can read them today. Verres was not worried. He had powerful friends in Rome, senators who had shared in his plunder, who had received gifts of stolen artwork, who stood to lose as much as Verres if the full scope of the corruption became public. His defense lawyer was Quintus Hortensius Hortellus, the most famous advocate of the generation, a man known for his prodigious memory, his dramatic delivery, and his ability to charm any jury. Hortensius had never lost a major case. The trial had been deliberately scheduled during a festival period, the Ludi Votivi, when the courts would be half empty and public attention elsewhere. Verres and his allies expected to run out the clock, delay the proceedings until Hortensius could take office as consul the following year, and use his influence to quash the case entirely. Cicero did something no one expected. Instead of delivering the elaborate, multi-day opening speech that Roman legal tradition demanded, a full rhetorical performance, with dramatic digressions, philosophical asides, and emotional appeals to the jury, the kind of speech Hortensius excelled at and could be expected to match, Cicero simply presented the evidence. Witness after witness, document after document. Stolen statue after stolen statue, identified by name, described in detail, traced from its original home to Verres's private collection. He brought Sicilian farmers to Rome to testify, men who had traveled hundreds of miles to tell the court what the governor had done to them. He produced account books, letters, contracts, tax records. He named names, dates, and amounts. He was relentless, methodical, devastating. The case was over in 9 days. Verres did not even wait for the verdict. He packed his stolen artwork into crates and fled to Marseille, where he lived in exile for the next 27 years, surrounded, according to the ancient sources with a note of delicious irony, by the very artworks he had stolen from Sicily. He could not display them publicly, could not show them to guests, could only sit alone with his plundered beauty in a small house in a foreign city growing old. What must that have been like? Surrounded by stolen beauty in permanent exile, able to see the art but never show it. I find myself returning to this trial when I think about what the Forum actually was on a daily basis when the great dramas were not playing out. Because most days, the Forum was not about triumphs or assassinations or the rise and fall of empires. Most days, it was about people trying to get justice. Merchants suing over broken contracts. Families fighting over inheritances. Freed slaves asserting their rights. Citizens accusing magistrates of abuse of power. The ordinary, necessary, unglamorous work of a civilization trying to govern itself by rules rather than by force. The basilicas were open to the public. Any Roman citizen could walk in off the street and watch a trial in progress. The proceedings were conducted in Latin, formal, structured, governed by rules and precedents that had been refined over centuries. There were prosecutors and defense lawyers, witnesses and cross-examinations, judges and juries. The system was imperfect. Wealth and influence mattered enormously. Bribery was common. Political cases were often decided by backroom deals before the trial began. But the system existed. It was public. It was recorded. It was, in its flawed and deeply human way, an attempt to govern by law rather than by the arbitrary will of the powerful. The Forum gave that system a physical home. The basilicas, with their high ceilings and echoing naves, were designed to hold crowds and carry voices. Acoustics mattered. The judges needed to hear the witnesses needed to be heard by the public, and the public needed to hear the judges. Daylight poured in through high clerestory windows, illuminating the proceedings with natural light. The marble floors reflected sound upward, amplifying voices the way a concert hall amplifies music. If you had been standing in that basilica in 70 BC, you would have heard Cicero's voice rising and falling sharp with accusation, soft with sympathy for the Sicilian victims, quiet with mock incredulity as he described one outrageous theft after another. You would have heard the scratch of the court recorder's stylus on wax tablets, taking down the testimony. You would have heard the crowd murmuring approval, shock, outrage, the occasional bark of laughter at Cicero's wit. And outside, through the open doors of the basilica, the noise of the forum continuing, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. The city did not stop for trials. The city never stopped. This was not perfect justice, but it was public justice, visible justice, justice that happened in a building you could walk into without an appointment, without a ticket, without permission. And that mattered. In a world where most disputes were settled by the powerful